Good afternoon and welcome to Leadership Lunch and Learn. I'm Julie Robinson with the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture Cooperative Extension Service in the Community Professional and Economic Development Department. And we're so glad that you've joined us today. And we're very excited about our guest speaker, and that's Mr. Jeff Amrine. And he is the founder and managing director of Startup Junkie Consulting. And Jeff is one of the key leaders nationally involved with the creation of lasting venture ecosystems. He has held senior leadership positions in 9 startups and 3 Fortune 500 companies. And he's made more than 80 plus angel investments into new ventures and small businesses, either directly or through funds that he manages. And he's got a pretty extensive bio. But Jeff is going to be talking about fostering innovation in the workplace. And so without taking up more of his time, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff so we can learn more from him. So Jeff.
Julie, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Well, so what we're going to talk about, and again, Julie gave a really generous introduction there. I do run Startup Junkie Consulting. We run an innovation practice as well called Innovation Junkie, which is why you'll see the slides branded that way, that is aimed at helping innovators and entrepreneurs and for-profit nonprofits that are a little larger than startup stage. And so a lot of what we cover today will be not only relevant to just new ventures, but how to drive innovation and new thinking and creativity into organizations of any size. So the stuff that we go through today works well for a pre-revenue startup, and it works equally well for the world's largest companies. And let's see, we'll move to the next slide. Here's some of the things we'll cover. I'll go through a little bit of the connection between leadership and innovation. We'll go through some definitions of innovation. Innovation is one of those buzzwords that gets used quite a bit, so we'll try to define it. Then we'll go through some very specific processes and tools that might be useful to you. We'll give you some thoughts about how to get started, and at the end, as Julie said, we'll have some Q&A. So what do we mean when we say innovation and leadership are inseparable? The way to think about this is as follows. Every organization needs to constantly figure out how to reinvent themselves, but that only really happens if the leadership is committed to the process. You're not able to build a culture of innovation unless the leadership is committed to it. And you can't really isolate innovators to that group that's responsible for innovation. If you want to have a true culture of innovation, it's got to permeate everything you do. You've got to be thinking about, how can we do process improvement? That's a form of innovation. How can we take great big jumps and do things that are really amazing that will separate us from potential competition? So it's one of those things that really has to permeate the thinking. And the only way that happens is with the leadership being bought in to the importance of the process. And so we'll go through a bit of a primer for how some of this works. What is it? I mean, there's lots of ways you could define it, but if you wanted to go to some specific kind of dictionary related definitions, you'd say the first one would be, we aim to create a more pleasant or efficient way of doing things. Another way of looking at it is a process that will substantially reduce the cost of doing business. And finally, maybe it's better, more efficient or productive products, services, or technologies or ideas. When you think about innovation, think about moving from the status quo, whatever that may be. It can be a small jump, it can be incremental, or it can be a really substantial change. And so there's 3 forms or 3 buckets in the way we think about that. One is incremental. Some of the classical things that we've looked at in total quality management and constant improvement and Six Sigma, those are really about incremental process improvement, and that's a form of innovation, getting constantly better every day. And in fact, you could argue most of the innovations we see in the world truly are incremental. Everyone likes to point to the iPhone, for example, as being an innovation. Well, the fact is that smartphones had been around for quite some time before Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. So the iPhone, in every sense, was incremental. It was just done substantially better than the existing mobile phones that were out at the time, smartphones that were out at the time. The next thing you can think about is breakthrough innovations. Breakthrough innovations are where there's something really important that hasn't happened the way in a similar way before. So a good example would be in the last year with the vaccine development, there was some substantial breakthroughs, particularly in the methodology that Moderna and Pfizer used in how to develop the vaccine. It was a completely different process than had been used in vaccine development before, and consequently, it was a major breakthrough. It's part of the reason why the cycle time in getting to market was less than a year rather than maybe 3 to 5 to 10 years to get a new vaccine out. The third bucket that we like to think about is disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation is something that would change the way an entire market is operating, an entire mode of transportation, for example. So for sure, the automobile was disruptive to horse and buggy travel. The railroad was extremely disruptive. There have been a number of things in the past 20 years that have been disruptive. They've really changed the way we look at innovation. A good example would be home-based personal computers. How many IBM Selectric typewriters do you see anymore? I mean, that was a disruptive innovation that really changed the way people did business. And you could maybe even make the argument that being able to work remote through great tools like Zoom and Google Meet and Teams is pretty disruptive. Those are an extension of existing technologies, but it's definitely disrupted things. One of the things you might want to do is we do have an Innovation Junkies podcast where we interview some of the best and brightest innovators from across the country. That's newly rolled out, but feel free to check it out. I think it's available both on YouTube and through the innovationjunkies.com website if you want to take a listen. So sometimes when we think about innovation, we get fixated on this idea that it has to be a moonshot. And what is a moonshot? These are the statistical outliers in every sense of the word in innovation. But typically, a moonshot blueprint will include a huge problem. It'll include a radical solution, something completely different, and a breakthrough technology. So the intersection of those three things would be a good example of a moonshot. Perfect example is what SpaceX is able to do with reusable rocket stages, being able to land those on small platforms. That's something that's very innovative, more innovative in many respects than the shuttle program, which was able to land the crew, so to speak, in the shuttle, but all the other parts were essentially disposable and not able to be reused. So that's an example of something that can be a huge problem. It's a radical solution, and they've definitely had to have breakthrough technologies in terms of controls and telemetry and a whole variety of other things. So why do innovation projects and startups typically fail? Well, there's some pretty fundamental reasons, and that will get to some of the process that we talk about. The most fundamental thing is that you're building something that no one really wants. So this happens oftentimes to highly technical people. We tend to fall in love with our own ideas and our own technology, and we spend the time and the resources, and we stay in the lab or inside the four walls of our organization. And when we launch the product, we realize, or the service, that we're solving a problem that no one really cares a lot about. Now, there's some other reasons as well. You might not have the right team, you might not be funded well, but the number one reason is you've built something that no one wants. So what can we do about that? Well, before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of the lean canvas methodology and how you start with the problem. But this is a reiteration here of how innovation and leadership can go together, and a process, a way to think about it as you begin to attack it. So when you want to think about game changers for your organizations, think about what's the biggest problem, result, or opportunity. Sometimes we call that PRO, that if you solved it, you seized it, you achieved it, it'd be a total game changer for the organization. Now, out of that, you may get a residual in that there's lots of incremental innovations that are also great. But start by thinking, what are those game changers? Then think about what are all the reasons why it can't be solved or why it might be difficult to solve, the constraints. Sometimes you would think of these as risks, the things that could cause it to fail. Also ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen if you fail? If that happens, could you live with it? This again gets to the idea of trying to remove the risk that could cause that project or that innovation to fail. So a lot of times we'll go through a process of thinking about, would it be a critical failure, a major failure, or a minor failure if something went wrong? Critical failure might be an existential risk to the organization. Major might be a big setback, minor something you could deal with. Any of those can happen on a project. The idea is to identify them and then work through a process of mitigating those risks. Start with some crazy ideas. What are the crazy ideas that you have to solve the problems? You know, the whole point of brainstorming is you spend time with stickies on the wall or on the whiteboard, just coming up with all the possible ways that you might solve the problem in a meaningful way. And then for those of you that are in leadership positions, whether informal or formal, how are you going to lead through to a solution? And how would you actually get started? What will you do tomorrow? A lot of what I'll talk about is not just the thinking part, but the doing part, because innovation by its nature is a process of iteration where you have to try some things in order to move the process forward. So much of that, if you adopt the mindset of a startup, you think like a startup, think about what startups are all about. They have scarce resources. They have to really leverage the things that don't cost them money in the beginning. They have to try a lot of things up front. So think like a startup, be scrappy. That's kind of the mindset that you take when you start thinking about innovation. And it also requires the organization to be a little bit tolerant towards small failures on the way towards a much greater success. This is an example of kind of that backwards process of, well, we've got a solution and we wonder if there's a problem that we can find that the solution will actually resolve. Many times in research intensive enterprises, you have something that's interest, you go deep on the research, and you just hope that you can find a group that has a problem that will fit within that solution set that you've already built. Sometimes classically we'd call that technology push versus demand pull. Both are important, but you improve your probabilities of success if you really understand the problems that people will pay to have solved first. And so a couple of books, key books. These are sort of, I'll have a blog actually coming out on the startupjunkie.org site soon that will talk about these two in a little more depth. But Running Lean is a process that was developed by Ash Moore. He's based in Austin. This takes all the sort of seminal work that Steve Blank did out of Stanford and Eric Ries, and it boils it down into a very simple one-page format that allows you to go from your initial plan, your assumptions or your guesses, to a plan that actually works in a business model for a new innovation. And it can apply equally to a large organization trying to do a new product or new service offering, or a brand new startup. And the other book that is really crucially important, and it's kind of got a lot of far side like illustrations in it, was written by a guy named Giff Constable from NYU Stern, called Talking to Humans. And for those of you with academic background, he goes in great depth about how to do qualitative inquiry and ask good open-ended questions. So it's not traditional quantitative research. It's more about really finding key themes and meanings, and not building confirmation bias into the way you approach conversations with your stakeholders or your market, your customers. So what is this lean canvas thing that we've been talking about? When I first saw this more than 10 years ago, having been a serial entrepreneur, I thought, gee, I mean, I can't believe somebody actually took the time to put this down on paper because it seems so simple. What's the big deal? Well, what you find is that the simplest tools are the ones that can be used to greatest impact, really. What this forces you to do is to capture all of your assumptions around key aspects of a new business, a new innovation, a new product, or new service on a single page. And it's an exercise in documenting assumptions or guesses about the 9 boxes that you see here in front of you, and then going through a process iteratively of proving or disproving your assumptions about what you're trying to do. This is truly the replacement for a comprehensive business plan, in that this is a tool of iteration that allows you to use what we all learned in scientific method, which is assumption testing, and apply that to the business model that underpins the innovation that you want to create. And so the process we typically look at when we go through the lean canvas is this idea of starting with the problem and articulating 3 aspects of the problem. And then rather than immediately jumping to solution, we think, who are the customers or the stakeholders that actually have this problem, and how do we know? And it forces you to think about things like existing alternatives and early adopters, but you start on the outside of the lean canvas and you work your way towards the center. This process also forces you to think about unique value proposition. This is that connective tissue that ties the problems you're trying to solve to the customers that want it solved, and it forces you to articulate in a single sentence or two a very short way of what the value is that you're delivering and why it's unique. So as an example, the one that gets used often is right up the road from where we are in Bentonville. You have the world's largest retailer, and you'll hear people say, save money and live better. And that is, in fact, their tagline. But the expanded unique value proposition is we're going to help people save money and live better through everyday low pricing and the world's most efficient supply chain. And that's what they delivered on, all of those pieces. So when you think about unique value proposition, it's a little bit tagline, it's a little bit of a brand promise, but it's definitely the one thing that everybody in the organization that would be working on a specific innovation would be able to recite about what they're doing. The other boxes on here, like solution, you fill those in. What I like to see on a solution box are details around not just the features, but the benefits that will convey to the customer. Unfair advantage. Sometimes an unfair advantage can be manifest in unique subject matter expertise. It can be manifest in intellectual property like patents, trademarks, trade secrets, contracts, that sort of thing. You'll put things down here that would come from a typical pro forma income statement, a little bit about the cost structure and how you're going to make money in terms of revenue streams. And then key metrics are how you're going to measure progress. What are those meaningful milestones that you're going to meet along the way towards realizing this innovation? And the channels are, what do you have to do to take it to market? How are you going to sell it? Or how are you going to communicate it internally? That's really all there is to it. We train this to students who are in elementary school. We train this to PhD level folks that are in large corporations, researchers. I mean, this has a real utility because it's a process of easily capturing assumptions. So we're obviously, big fans of Lean Canvas. And this is where you start, problem and customer segments. So what makes sense of all of it, once you document your assumptions, you're still inside the building, so to speak. You have to go out and try to find, is there a product market fit? Does that mean, what that means is this something where a customer or stakeholder can really derive value from it? And how do you know? And you have to do it in kind of a sneaky way, right? You can't go out, particularly in the South, you can't go out and say, gee, what do you think of my idea? In the South, they're going to say, it's great, I love it, I'd buy it, because they don't want to hurt your feelings. Unless you find the hidden, well, bless your heart statement in there, you're not going to know that it really is not solving a problem they care about. So you have to ask questions that hit around problems that they may have without giving away the solution that you have in mind. There's a real trick to it, and we'll get into a few more details on that as we go. But customer discovery is where you go out and talk to 10 potential customers, stakeholders, subject matter experts. You ask them a short number of questions. You're looking for key themes. And once you find those themes, you then iterate your lean canvas to capture those key learnings. The other thing that we can add in and these things are related, they're not mutually exclusive, and there is some nuance. Design thinking is, some of you may have heard of an organization called IDEO that created many great innovations for Apple and others in California. And they are the inspiration behind the design school that's out at Stanford. This is part and parcel of the same sort of methodology we just talked about with Lean Canvas. It forces you to be empathetic, to really observe and try to understand what matters to your customer. You're then going to define, based on those needs, what you're actually going to do. You may come up and brainstorm some interesting ways of approaching that problem, because there could be multiple paths. You'll then build something early, rapid prototype, right? This is what we'd sometimes call a minimally viable product or a minimally viable service. You'll roll that out in many instances before it's really ready, because that's the process of iteration. And then you'll test it, and you'll go through this process a number of different times. It's a process of iteration and design thinking. And it's also linked to something that back in the dark ages, when I first began in telecom and software development companies, we called this the spiral methodology. But it was this whole idea of not waiting until every aspect of a hardware or software innovation was completely done to roll it out. And a good example of classic waterfall methodology, which is the other side of this, is you'd have to have all the requirements done, all the specifications done, all the design done, the system built, the system tested, and then finally rolled out. And you find out after 3 years of doing that, you missed the mark. You didn't build what people really wanted. Agile development is this idea of spiraling through needed functionality progressively to get feedback from the market to determine what to do next. And it's this whole idea of rapidly releasing incrementally new aspects of the product or the service that you're trying to develop. So you'll hear software developers talk a lot about agile development, closely related to lean canvas and also design thinking. And it's all about iteration. And here you kind of see the innovator's method. There's an insight, there's a problem. We've done some customer discovery. We're going to come up with a minimally awesome product. You hope it's awesome. It may just be viable. You're going to roll it out. You're going to validate some things about the business model, and then you'll go on to the next process. But it's a constant process of iteration. You're never really done. Once you have that good fit, you scale the innovation, you roll it out far and wide. And this gives you an idea of kind of a bit of a Gantt chart view of how this can go and how the various pieces fit together. You'll see here referenced at the bottom business model canvas. That was Steve Blank's original format. The lean canvas is the one we prefer because we think it's a little bit easier to use. But all of these things are related, and the fundamental underpinning of all of it is you keep an open mind, you ask good questions, you document your assumptions, and you try to prove or disprove your assumptions as you go, and you add more detail and key learnings with each progressive step. So one of the ways, and I'm going to take you through a little bit of sort of the hypothetical way that we, actually the actual way that we do this. We've got an organization coming in, a large nonprofit, on May 6th to our office, and we're going to go through this very flow that you're about to see. We've done similar things with large banks as well when they're trying to think about how to reinvent. So a way to do it when you think about game changers is you challenge everybody that's participating in the process. What's one problem, result, or opportunity that if you solved it, seized it, or achieved it would be a complete game changer? And you could fill in the blank here for our department, for our company, for our team, etc. But that's a starting point. And then you go through and you try to articulate the problem statement itself in 12 words or less. So being succinct is difficult. Sometimes we find people that want to fill up the problem section of a lean canvas with number 4 font so that there's absolutely no white space. So this is also an exercise in concise communication and brevity. How can you just boil it down to the point that it's the equivalent of a headline in a newspaper? It tells you just enough information so that you know what you're dealing with. And then you think about, well, what are some key issues that result from the problem? So in business, for that matter, in any kind of organization, if there's not an economic impact, in other words, if it's not going to have some positive impact on your top line or your bottom line, or some positive impact on the people that you're trying to serve, then you might get the so what. I mean, why are we spending time on this? So it forces you to think about what are the key issues? What's the so what factor for trying to do? How is this really going to help the organization or help the people? And then how do you know? The background evidence. You'll see up there, we talk about quantitative validation. This is a step where you may gather existing known evidence, third-party research, details from your own data gathering to find background evidence. What are 3 to 5 credible facts or statistics? Initially, a lot of times when you're filling out the lean canvas, you've got a bunch of assumptions, and you may use words like better or best. There may be adjectives in there. What I like to say is when you get to the point that you can make an assertion and back it up with a credible fact or a quantitative statistic, then you've got something that really validates the assertion that you've made. How bad, how good, how big, how small something is. So backing up those assertions with empirical evidence is where you want to get to on the lean canvas as you're going through your assumptions. The other important thing too is to understand who are the key stakeholders or customers. Well, what do I mean by that? Typically, when we think about the people that will be the beneficiaries of what you're doing, there's different personas or different roles that those stakeholders will take. If you're selling into an enterprise, to use that as an example, you'll typically have an economic decision maker. This is somebody that might be CEO, CFO, somebody that's got budget authority that will make a final decision. You'll also have the role of a technical recommender or an influencer, somebody that's got to really do diligence on what you're doing, pass judgment on it. They're going to be part of a buying or approval process. And then you can have sort of influencers and also saboteurs. There may be people that are displaced or uncomfortable or made uncomfortable by what you're doing. So understanding the stakeholders and what role they play and how you're going to have to address the issues they have in order to make a favorable decision is really important. And it's not necessarily selling at this point. It's just trying to understand how that organization decides what sort of innovation to take forward. Crucially important. Oftentimes things get killed not because it wasn't a great innovation, it's because people didn't understand the decision-making power map in order to get something approved inside an organization really of any size. This is the qualitative validation, and this is where we'll get into this customer and stakeholder feedback, how to do it, and how to guard against confirmation bias. So I'm going to flip to the next slide here. It's taken straight from Talking to Humans, which is a really short, it's about a 75-page book, pretty humorous in parts of it. The gold standard for customer discovery, and this is one where we tend to get a jaw drop, is aim for 100 interviews. If you were to go through this process with the National Science Foundation I-Corps summer program, which researchers oftentimes will go through, or other entrepreneurs, the gold standard is you got to do 100 interviews. And it's so uncomfortable for people to get out by a Zoom or face-to-face. This is not my Qualtrics SurveyMonkey survey. This is actual face-to-face or Zoom-to-Zoom engagement with people, asking them questions. And face-to-face, which I will include in that Zoom or Google Meet or phone, are the top two ways of doing it, not sending out an emailed survey. You're going to ask open-ended questions. It's a little bit like being a CSI or a detective. The questions are your guide, and you can deviate from the questions as you begin to sense heat and energy around a particular theme or topic. You can continue to go deep. I mean, it's a classic qualitative interview methodology. Better to have two interviewers, one to actually do the face-to-face engagement, one to take the notes and record the non-verbal cues that you're getting. It's very difficult to do with just one person doing the interview and trying to capture everything. And at this point, you're really looking for pain. You're not trying to sell anything. You're looking to learn. So you take that kind of investigator mindset. So what might the questions look like? And these are very specific to if you were trying to understand something about how an organization operates. You might ask them something like, what are the top 5 problems or opportunities the company faces today? How do you solve that problem today? What's the economic impact of that problem? How would you rate the existing solutions to that problem? What is the total cost of ownership of your current solution? How do you currently purchase enterprise solutions? You notice I didn't say anything in there at all about what I might have had in mind for the solution. I'm trying to understand, what are their pain points? What are their problems? And you notice there's also no yes, no questions, which in this methodology are pretty useless. You want to ask questions that force you to listen and force them to convey to you what's on their mind. This is so crucial in trying to understand if an innovation that you want to create is actually going to resonate either internal to your organization or with an external constituency that you're trying to work with. After you go through that kind of process, and remember I said it is a process of iteration, you'll find that you have to pivot and you might have to revise your problem statement. You will most certainly find out that the problem or aspects of the problem that you originally assumed is not what you find out once you engage with potential customers. So you're going to update it. You're going to update that lean canvas starting with the problem statement. And this gives you an idea of how you might capture all of that. This comes from what we call our innovation blueprint that ties leadership and innovation together. And it gives some of the process. It's kind of a reiteration of the process we just talked about. There's the problem statement with key issues. There's the quantitative evidence that you might gather from third-party sources, the qualitative evidence you get from your customer discovery, and then an updated, finalized problem statement. Sometimes what we'll advise is use this methodology to really work on problem, customer segment, and unique value proposition before you fill out any of the rest of the lean canvas. because those are the most important things on the front end to focus on. Then you spend a lot of time thinking of solution development. And this can be, sometimes solutions can be things that don't scale. So oftentimes as technologists, we think, well, we got to build some software or hardware. Sometimes it's just a matter of what can I do with existing tools or techniques to implement the solution initially to understand uh, is something simple that doesn't require automation going to work. But we'll typically drive the teams that we work with through 2 or 3 ideas per team. And we encourage them not to be caught up in those typical ways that they've done stuff. Think a little bit outside of their normal way of thinking. And when you know that you're zeroing in on a quality solution design after you go through that, when there's desirability, in other words, people are interested in it, it's viable, the economics are there from the business standpoint, and it's technically feasible. There's no real dramatic technical hurdles you have to get through. A lot of times understanding these aspects, desirability, viability, and then technical feasibility, will determine how much risk there is and whether or not that innovation that you have in mind can actually be rolled out. And we'll ask additional questions. Is it real? Can we win? And is it worth it? I mean, that's another way of looking at it. So if you do all that, and this is the idea, you do all that, you've got this alignment between people, business, and technical, you're at that sweet spot, it's something that could scale throughout your organization or throughout the market, and you're delivering massive value as a result of it, that's when you know you're in sort of the right spot. Now, this is very much oriented towards breakthrough or disruptive innovation. Incremental innovation, the hurdles are a little bit lower and they're more obvious and they're shorter cycles so that you can get them done more quickly. But this gives you kind of a bit of the template that comes out of our innovation blueprint. So a meaningful illustration, you notice I said a lot of this is an exercise in how to communicate well. And one of the most difficult things people have sometimes with innovation or with creating a new venture is they have difficulty telling the story. And there's a lot in that, how you do that well. So as an idea, you want it to be something where it's going to stick by virtue of your communication. You're going to be able to build a base of support and early adopters. You're going to be able to create the right climate. All of these things are really, really important as how you go through it. You've got to start with that right climate for innovation. You've got to build the support. And if you communicate it well, either to the market or internally, you can make it stick. And that's when you get to the point where you can begin to execute on the innovation and truly roll it out. So when you do a presentation around all this, what does that outline need to look like? This one is specifically talking about how to communicate problem statement, the key evidence that you had based on your customer discovery and your quantitative work, and in some aspects of the proposed solution or innovation. So when we're going through an innovation sprint, the initial presentation they'll do after maybe a half a day's work falls into this kind of category. And it's important to use simple language, to avoid jargon, to the extent that you can, to use good illustration, good storytelling, to convey it in a way that it can pass the grandparent test. So if you come up with something and you don't think you could explain it to a grandparent in simple language, then you're probably not communicating well. And that is really a big part of this. It may have been, I can't remember who it was, an early innovator, it might have been Einstein, that said, if you can't explain it in simple language, you probably don't understand it well enough. The same thing applies here, avoiding jargon and explaining things simply. And so to recap, innovation and leadership are inseparable. Sometimes you will see leadership that they know they need to check a box to say we're being innovative, and it's what I'd like to call innovation theater. They go through some process. It's maybe just a superficial effort. It doesn't become integral to the culture, and therefore they don't get the impact out of innovation you might get otherwise. But the way we think about going through it is it's a problem that's worth solving. We've got the wisdom to recognize it. We understand the constraints. The organization has a willingness to fail incrementally, not in the long term, but to lose some battles on the way to winning the war. You don't mind entertaining crazy ideas. You've got the courage to attempt it. And this is some of what we covered today in very summary fashion, you have the tools to innovate well along the way. So that kind of covers a bit of the landscape there. And there's so much here that it was challenging to come up with what are the kind of the top level points to give you a flavor for this. But there's some other things that are available to you if you want to delve in more deeply. By virtue of the pandemic, the Startup Junkie team has a comprehensive and completely free library of educational materials that includes things like the Lean Canvas video tutorial, which is linked here, and I'll make sure the team has access to this, and a customer discovery tutorial. You can go through in much more depth on those and in many other subjects. And for those of you that are interested a little bit in the startup junkie journey, or from the economic development standpoint of what it takes to build a sustainable venture ecosystem in an unexpected place like Arkansas, we've written a book on that, myself and Dr. Jeff Stanridge, who's my co-author and also the director of The Conductor, freely available on Amazon. I shouldn't say free, it's 99 cents to download the Kindle version, a little bit more for a hardback. But if you're interested in that whole aspect, which looks at how to create a venture ecosystem that's driven on talent and availability of capital, reinforcing the entrepreneurial culture, and then engaging the community, feel free to take a look. And at this point, that's all I've got for today. I'm happy to entertain any questions.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much. And if we aren't able to get those links in the chat right now, we'll definitely send them out with the recording. So folks, go ahead and enter any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we'll get those to Jeff. But one question that I've got here is, how do you work with or what do you recommend when you're working with decision makers that are very risk averse? What kind of tips or tricks or suggestions that you have?
Yeah, it's that's always a challenge, and that's really most economic decision makers. I think you have to build the business case that makes sense. So when you go through that, you build the value justification that shows that the innovation that you have in mind has long-term value to the organization. And in post 2001, quite honestly, post the dot-com bubble, nobody is implementing innovation or technology for the sake of innovation and technology. You have to be able to pretty quickly show this is either going to reduce our cost or increase our revenues. It's got to have some kind of a measurable impact. There are things, particularly in social ventures or organizations that are focused on social, where you can make the case around the value of the innovation, which is non-tangible. That tends to be more difficult. It's based a lot on anecdotal evidence, but you're always going to win with an economic decision maker if you can show them, if we spend this over the long run, we're going to have this kind of payback, and it's going to impact either revenues or costs in a favorable way.
All right. Another question that I've got here, you mentioned brainstorming earlier. How a lot of folks have a difficult time setting aside time to brainstorm. We get caught up in day to day. What do you recommend kind of blocking that time to brainstorm and think about things?
It's actually a fantastic question that I suspect everybody struggles with and every organization struggles with it. And I'm going to answer that question in a little bit of a roundabout way. We as a society and many organizations say we need to be innovative. We need to be innovative. We need to do great new things. And then we have misaligned incentives where we don't provide any time or resource allocation to the people we're asking to be innovative or the people we're asking to commercialize technology. And consequently, it becomes one more thing. So if you have to have an incentive alignment, again, this is where leadership comes in, that says, like Google does, 10% of your time, and it's something that will be on your evaluation, I want you thinking about new things. Then you can begin to block time off on the calendar. But if you don't have that sort of high level support, it's extremely difficult for somebody to say, well, I'm going to take on just one more thing when my week is already 50, 60, 70 hours of work. So you have to be intentional, you have to have aligned incentives, and it has to be built in as part of the culture. And then personally, and I struggle with this because I have a lot of things going on, you just have to create that quiet time sometimes early in the morning or late afternoon, sometime without distraction, where you can sit down and journal some of this stuff down. What are 3 or 4 ideas that I've been thinking about that could really change this organization if they were implemented? And then ideas can be commodities. So you really have to, once you do that, if you think they're worthy, you've got to get into the mode of having a process that allows you to get to execution, or at least vetting the idea. Otherwise you're just dreaming, and that's not going to do you any good through the process. Hopefully that helps.
Absolutely. Another question is, what advice would you give to business owners that say we want innovation in our workplace, but we don't want projects to fail? So, kind of getting past the risk aversion part of it, but how do you explain to individuals that innovation, being innovative, requires that vulnerability or potential loss? I mean, how do
Yeah,
you?
I mean, no, that's a legitimate question. And one thing is, it's easy for me to say things like low jingoism, like fail fast and iterate and all that. And the key is, with an iterative process, is it small failures along the way. So it's not major failures that are going to tank the company. So figuring out how to do things on a smart incremental way. The lean canvas is the perfect example of that. Too often we see businesses that bet the business on something the founder or the leadership team thought was a good idea, and they did it in kind of a waterfall method where they went out and spent a ton of money to build it, and then it gets to the market and it flops. The whole idea of lean canvas is incrementally learning before you spend a ton of money on expensive resources, software and hardware development, or processes. So using the lean canvas method is a way to pull the senior leadership into the process to understand, hey, we're being really risk averse. The whole point of lean canvas is to identify the things that could crater this ultimately, and to mitigate those risks early.
All right. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for taking time to present to our group and also answer some really good questions. We appreciate your time and for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And consider us a resource. The one thing that I didn't say is all the services that we provide for pre-revenue to companies doing 10 to 50 million in sales are completely free. There's never a charge. So we're looking for innovators and entrepreneurs that need the help, and we're here to serve.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us.